October 12, 1943. 23,000 feet above the Rhineland, a B-17 Flying Fortress, tail number 423067, lurched violently as a 20mm cannon shell tore through its number 3 engine. Black smoke poured from the cowling like a storm cloud ripping open in the sky. Inside the cockpit, First Lieutenant Robert Hayes felt the control yoke shudder in his hands. The aircraft's nose dropped 15 degrees as the bomber lost power. Warning lights blinked angrily across the instrument panel behind. In the radio room, Sergeant Mike Donnelly watched hydraulic fluid spray across the fuselage wall like blood from an artery. The fortress was dying, and they were still 140 miles from England. Above and slightly to the right, another pilot saw everything happen. First Lieutenant James Howell rolled his P-47 Thunderbolt into a hard banking turn. The fighter's polished metal skin flashed in the cold sunlight as he tracked the crippled bomber below. Painted beneath the cockpit of his aircraft, the words Jersey Thunder. Howell was 24 years old. A farm boy from New Jersey who had logged over 300 combat hours flying escort missions across occupied Europe. He had flown 72 missions, and he knew exactly what happened to bombers that fell out of formation. They died. The rest of the bomber formation continued forward without hesitation. That was standard procedure. One damaged aircraft could not risk the entire formation.
Hundreds of men depended on discipline. No one
turned back. Hayes understood this. Every bomber pilot understood it. Inside the cockpit, his co-pilot, Lieutenant Frank Morrison, was already doing the math in his head. 3 engines remaining. Maximum speed maybe 160 knots. Altitude bleeding away at nearly 200 feet per minute. And German fighters were already circling in the distance like sharks that smelled blood. Howell keyed his radio. Big friend, this is Jersey 27. I have you visual. Stay with me. Static crackled before Hayes and
Jersey, we're losing hydraulics. Number 3 is on fire. We can't maintain altitude.
Howell looked down at the burning bomber. Copy that, big friend. I'm not going anywhere. It was a promise he had absolutely no authority to make. His fuel gauge showed 58 minutes remaining. Maybe less, depending on throttle settings. The bomber below was crawling through the sky at barely 140 knots. England was still 90 miles northwest. The math didn't look good for anyone. The mission had begun 6 hours earlier at RAF Thorpe Abbotts, home of the famous 100 bomb group. Hayes and his crew were flying their 19th combat mission. Their target was the ball-bearing factories at Schweinfurt, deep inside Germany. The mission briefing had promised light resistance. Intelligence had been catastrophically wrong. That morning, 320 B-17 bombers crossed the English Channel in massive formation. The Luftwaffe responded with overwhelming force. More than 400 German fighters rose into the sky. Intercept them. Messerschmitt Bf-199s, Focke-Wulf FW-190s, they attacked in waves. The sky over Germany turned into a slaughterhouse. Bombers burned. Some spun out of control, trailing smoke and debris. Others simply exploded mid-air. Men parachuted into enemy territory. If they were lucky, the escorting P-47 Thunderbolts fought desperately, but their range was limited. At the German border, their fuel forced them to turn back. From that point forward, the bombers were on their own. Aircraft took its first hit during the bomb run. Anti-aircraft flak burst beneath the bomber like black thunderclouds. Jagged pieces of steel shrapnel tore through the thin aluminum skin. Inside the ball turret, Sergeant Eddie Martinez screamed as fragments ripped into his left shoulder. In the waist gun position, Corporal Tommy Briggs was thrown backward when a metal shard dented his helmet hard enough to knock him unconscious. Then the fighters came. 4 FW-190s dove from high above. Wings flashed as their cannons opened fire. Sergeant Paul Richter, manning the top turret, swung his guns upward and squeezed the triggers. Twin .50 caliber machine guns roared. Bright tracer rounds carved glowing lines through the sky. One of the German fighters flew straight into the stream of bullets. The aircraft exploded instantly. Flaming wreckage scattered across the sky. But the other 3 fighters continued their attack. That was when the number 3 engine took the fatal hit. Now, 15 minutes after leaving the target area, the bomber was barely holding together. Altitude dropped past 22,000 feet. Lieutenant Morrison tried desperately to restart the damaged engine, but the propeller only windmilled uselessly in the freezing air. Even worse, hydraulic pressure was failing. Without hydraulics, the gun turrets could no longer rotate properly. The bomb bay doors hung half open beneath the aircraft, creating massive drag. "Skipper," Morrison said quietly, "we should the crew to bail out." Hayes stared out the windshield. Below them stretched the farmland of occupied France, German territory. Any man who bailed out would likely become a prisoner of war. If they survived the parachute jump, Martinez was already wounded, could even jump with a shattered shoulder. Hayes shook his head. Not yet. Above them, James Howell scanned the sky constantly. His P-47 carried 8 .50 caliber machine guns, total ammunition 3 400 rounds, enough for roughly 30 seconds of continuous fire. He had already used 600 rounds earlier in the mission. That left maybe 28 seconds, not much. Suddenly his head snapped to the right. Movement 3 Messerschmitt Bf 1-9 fighters approaching from the south. They had spotted the wounded bomber. Stragglers were easy kills. Howell pushed his throttle forward instantly. The massive Pratt & Whitney R2800 engine roared with nearly 2,000 horsepower. The Thunderbolt surged forward. He positioned himself directly between the bomber and the incoming fighters. The German pilot saw him, but it was too late. Howell lined up the lead aircraft in his gun sight. He pressed the trigger. All 8 guns erupted at once. The recoil vibrated through the entire fighter. Tracer rounds streaked toward the German plane. Direct hits. The canopy shattered. Pieces of metal ripped away from the engine cowling. White coolant sprayed from the damaged radiator. The fighter rolled upside down and plunged toward the earth-trailing smoke. The other 2 German pilots immediately broke away. They had expected an easy kill. Instead, they found a P-47 flown by someone who knew exactly what he was doing. Inside the bomber, the crew heard Howell's guns firing outside. They realized someone was protecting them. Hayes keyed the radio. "Jersey, thanks for the save, but you're burning fuel. You should head home." Howell looked down at the crippled aircraft. "Negative, big friend. You got company all the way to the fence. Fighter pilot slang for the English Channel. Still 90 miles away." At their current speed, almost 40 minutes of fly. Howell glanced at his fuel gauge again. 42 minutes remaining. It was going to be close, dangerously close. The bomber continued descending, 20,000 feet, 19,000 dozen. Hayes fought the controls desperately, but physics had the final say. 3 engines could not hold altitude with this much damage. The aircraft was becoming a flying brick. At 18 feet, the bomber entered a thin layer of clouds. For 30 seconds, both aircraft flew blind. Only their instruments guided them. When they emerged into clear sky again, Howell immediately saw the next threat. 5 more German fighters approaching from directly ahead. Reinforcements. The real fight was about to begin. 5 German fighters were closing in fast. Their dark silhouettes grew larger against the pale sky as they advanced in a tight formation. Inside the bomber, the crew saw them too. "Fighters, 12 o'clock, someone shouted over the intercom. Hayes tightened his grip on the control yoke. Above them, James Howell had already reacted. He shoved the throttle forward and pushed the nose of his Thunderbolt down slightly, gaining speed before climbing straight toward the incoming formation. The German pilots saw him coming, 1 lone P-47 against 5 Messerschmitts. It should have been an easy victory, but this American pilot had already shot down one of their comrades. Approached cautiously. At 3,000 yards, Howell opened fire. The distance was extreme. No pilot expected to score hits from that far away. But Howell wasn't trying to destroy them. He was trying to break their formation. Bright tracer rounds streaked across the sky. The German leader flinched. His aircraft jerked sideways. The tight formation immediately collapsed. 2 fighters veered left, 2 broke right. The last one continued straight, aiming for the wounded bomber. How will have been eat? The scattered fighters rolled inverted and climbed sharply toward the trailing aircraft. He squeezed the trigger again. The Thunderbolt's 8 guns hammered. Bullets ripped across the German fighter's fuselage. The aircraft shuddered violently and began trailing smoke, but the battle wasn't finished. 2 of the Messerschmitts had circled behind the bomber. They were moving in for the kill. Inside the B-17's tail section, Sergeant Walt Kendrick spotted them first. He swung the twin .50 caliber machine guns into position. "Bandit, 6 o'clock, he shouted. He pulled the triggers. The guns fired 4 rounds. Then they jammed. Kendrick cursed loudly. He slammed his fist against the weapon and tried frantically to clear the malfunction. Outside, the German fighters closed in. Their cannons flashed. Howell saw the danger immediately. He hauled the Thunderbolt into a brutal high G turn. The massive fighter groaned under the stress as it curved through the sky. For a moment, his vision was gray from the force pressing him into the seat, but the maneuver worked. He came screaming down toward the nearest Messerschmitt. 600 yards, 500, 400, he fired. The burst tore across the German aircraft's wing root. Metal shredded instantly. The wing folded upward under the force of the air. The fighter spun wildly and vanished into the clouds below. The remaining German aircraft broke off the attack. 3 planes lost in only a few minutes. The crippled bomber was proving far more dangerous than expected. For a moment, the sky fell quiet again. Inside the cockpit, Hayes let out a slow breath. "Jersey 27, he said into the radio. "You just saved our lives." Howell didn't respond immediately. He was staring at his fuel gauge. 28 minutes remaining. He did the math quickly in his head. The English Channel was still 65 miles away. At the bomber's current speed, they needed about 30 minutes. He was already running out of time below him. The B-17 continued its slow descent. 16,000 feet. Still losing altitude. Inside the cockpit, Morrison glanced at Hayes. "We're not going to make it, are we?" Hayes studied the instruments carefully. Fuel levels, airspeed, engine temperatures, everything pointed to the same answer. "We'll reach the channel," Hayes finally said. He didn't finish the sentence. They both understood what came next. After that, they would ditch in the freezing water. The North Sea in October was brutally cold. Survival time in that water was barely 20 minutes. Above them, Howell faced the same brutal reality. His gauge now showed 23 minutes of fuel. The bomber needed at least 24 minutes to reach the English coast. He would run out of fuel 1 minute before they reached safety. Howell made his decision. He reduced his throttle to minimum cruise power. Then he leaned the fuel mixture to maximum economy. Every trick experienced pilots used to stretch their fuel supply. He could squeeze out 2 more minutes. Maybe that would be enough. Below them, the countryside of occupied France passed slowly beneath the aircraft. Small villages, farm fields, roads filled with German military trucks. All enemy territory. The bomber dropped to 15,000 feet. The fire in the damaged engine had finally burned itself out. There was nothing left to burn, but the drag from the broken propeller and torn cowling was enormous. Inside the cockpit, Hayes struggled to keep the aircraft stable. The controls felt sluggish. Hydraulic pressure was almost gone, 13,000 feet. Above and behind the bomber, Howell flew in a protective S pattern, constantly weaving, constantly scanning the sky. Check the fuel, check the sky, check the bomber, repat. Every German fighter pilot in northern France probably knew about this damaged aircraft by now, and they were hunting it 12,000 feet. The bomber punched through another cloud layer for several seconds, but aircraft vanished inside the white mist. When they emerged again, Morrison saw them first. Fighters, 10 o'clock high. Hayes turned his head quickly. 6 dark shapes diving from 17,000 feet. 6 Messerschmitt Bf-19s, perfectly organized. This wasn't a random encounter, this was a hunting pack. The Germans had assembled a strike force specifically to destroy this bomber. Howell saw them at the exact same moment, 6 against 1. He checked his ammunition counter. He had made 20 seconds of firing time left. Every bullet would have to count. He shoved the throttle forward again. Fuel economy didn't matter anymore. The Thunderbolt roared upward to meet the attackers. The distance closed rapidly, 1,000 yards. Howell fired. Again, the tracers streaked through the sky. The German formation scattered to avoid the incoming fire. The precise attack pattern collapsed. Howell singled out the rightmost fighter and dived toward it. 400 yards, he pulled trigger. The burst tore through the enemy plane's tail section. The entire rear of the aircraft disintegrated. The fighter flipped violently and fell spinning toward the ground, but the remaining 5 Messerschmitts attacked from different directions. 2 fighters dove toward the bomber from behind. Their cannons flashed. Inside the tail section, Kendrick had finally cleared the jam. He swung the guns into position and fired. Heavy .50 caliber rounds smashed into the lead attacker's engine. White smoke exploded from the cowling. The German pilot pulled away sharply, but the second fighter continued the attack. Its cannons fired again. Explosive shells ripped across the bomber's left wing. 1 shell detonated inside the number 2 fuel tank. The tank was almost empty, but fuel vapors ignited instantly. Flames erupted along the wing. Fire in number 2, Morrison shouted. He grabbed the fire suppression control and pulled the handle. Carbon dioxide flooded the engine compartment. After several terrifying seconds, the flames died, but the damage had already been done. The number 2 engine was destroyed. The propeller ceased completely. The bomber was now flying on only 2 engines out of 4. Altitude dropped past 11,000 feet. The aircraft began rolling slightly to the left as the drag from the dead engines pulled unevenly on the wings. Hayes fought the controls desperately. Skipper, Morrison said urgently, "We have to bail out." Hayes shook head again. "Not yet." He glanced upward. Jersey's still with us, and he was. Howell had engaged the remaining German fighters in a savage dogfight at 10,000 feet. The Thunderbolt's heavy armor saved him twice. 1 cannon shell slammed into the fuselage behind the cockpit but failed to penetrate. Another tore through the wing, missing the fuel tank by less than 2 feet. Despite the damage, Howell managed to destroy another Messerschmitt with a stunning deflection shot. The German fighter exploded midair. The remaining 3 enemy planes finally gave up. They turned east and disappeared. 3 more fighters lost. The kill wasn't worth the cost. Howell circled back toward the bomber. It was now descending through 9,000 feet. His fuel gauge showed 11 minutes remaining. The English Channel was still 42 miles away. At the bomber's speed, 18 minutes of flight time, 7 minutes short. He keyed the radio slowly. "Big friend, I'm gonna have to leave you soon. Fuel state critical." There was a long pause. Then Hayes answered quietly, "Understood, Jersey. You've already done more than anyone could ask. Get yourself home." Howell looked down at the battered bomber. "Negative. I'll stay with you as long as I can." Morrison leaned toward Hayes. "He's going to crash trying to save us." Hayes knew it was true. The math was brutally simple. If the fighter stayed with him all the way to the channel, he would run out of fuel over enemy territory, and when that happened, he would become a prisoner of war. Outside the bomber, the sky darkened slightly as clouds rolled in from the west. Below them, the coastline of France slowly approached. But they were still far from safety. And the worst part of the journey was still ahead, 8,000 feet. The damaged bomber continued its slow, painful descent through the cold European sky. The aircraft shuddered constantly now. Every gust of wind pushed the damaged frame like an invisible hand trying to tear it apart. Inside the cockpit, Lieutenant Robert Hayes could feel the controls getting heavier with every passing minute. Hydraulic pressure was nearly gone. He had to fight the aircraft just to keep the wings level. "Descent rate increasing," Morrison said quietly, staring at the instruments. 300 feet per minute, Hayes nodded grimly. At that rate, they would reach sea level long before reaching England. Behind them, James Howell kept his P-47 Thunderbolt moving in slow protective circles around the crippled bomber. His fuel gauge showed 10 minutes remaining. He knew the truth now. He wasn't going to make it home, but he stayed anyway. Below them, the French coastline finally appeared on the horizon like a dark gray line dividing land and sea. Beyond it stretched the English Channel, 35 miles of cold, violent water. Then England, then safety. But they still had to survive long enough to reach it. Inside the radio
room, Sergeant Donnelly worked desperately with the remaining hydraulic pressure. He began manually lowering the landing gear.
"Why the hell are you doing that?" Briggs asked from the waist gun position. Donnelly wiped sweat from his face. "If we somehow reach England, we'll need wheels." Briggs gave a tired laugh. "Yeah, 7,000 feet. The bomber crept toward the coastline. Above them, Howell scanned the sky constantly. German fighters could appear at any moment, but strangely,
sky remained empty. Maybe the Luftwaffe had finally given up. Maybe they believed the bomber would crash on its own. Either way, Howell wasn't taking chances. He stayed close. His fuel gauge dropped to 8 minutes. Inside the cockpit, Hayes spotted the coastline clearly now. "There it is," he said quietly. Morrison leaned forward. The jagged cliffs of northern France slid slowly beneath the bomber's nose. They crossed the coastline seconds later. Below them, the English channels endlessly toward the horizon. Dark gray water churned with whitecaps, cold of Yala, deadly. If they had to ditch out here, their chances were slim. "Water temperature about 50 degrees, Morrison said grimly. "Hypothermia in 20 minutes. Hayes didn't respond. He already knew. Above them, Howell checked his fuel again. 6 minutes. The English coast was still 28 miles away. He would run out of fuel long before reaching land. He pressed the radio button. "Big friend, I'm headed for the deck." Hayes frowned. "What do you mean?" "I'm going to ditch alongside you." Inside the bomber cockpit, both pilots froze. Morrison leaned toward the radio. "Jersey negative? You can still reach France?" Hayes spoke next. "You bail out over land and you survive as a prisoner. That's better than dying out here." There was a brief silence. Then Howell answered calmly. "Not leaving you, big friend. We're going home together, or not at all." Inside the bomber, every crew member heard those words over the intercom. Men who had already accepted death suddenly felt something different. Hope someone was staying with them. They weren't alone in the sky. 5,000 feet. Howell descended beside the bomber, now matching its altitude. His fuel gauge showed 3 minutes. The engine would stop soon. And when it did, he would have about 90 seconds of glide before hitting the water. 4,000 feet. Hayes scanned the ocean desperately. No ships, no rescue boats, just endless gray water. 3,000 feet. Howell's engine coughed suddenly. A violent sputtering sound shook the fighter. Fuel starvation. He switched fuel tanks quickly, hoping to squeeze out the last drops. 2,000 feet. Inside the bomber cockpit, Morrison began reading the ditching checklist. His voice sounded strangely calm. "Crew prepare for water landing. Assume crash positions. Impact in 90 seconds." In the tail section, Kendrick tightened his harness. In the radio room, Donnelly braced against the bulkhead. In the waist compartment, Briggs wedged himself between two equipment racks. Inside the ball turret, Martinez struggled to climb out. The ball turret would become a death trap if the aircraft landed in water. 1,000 feet. Outside, Howell's engine coughed again. The powerful Pratt & Whitney engine sputtered as the last drops of fuel burned away. Hayes lined the bomber into the wind. That would reduce their impact speed with the water. 100 feet, 700, 600. Suddenly, Howell's engine went silent. The roar vanished instantly. The propeller continued spinning, but there was no power left. The Thunderbolt had become a glider, and not a very good one. Howell pushed the nose downward slightly to keep enough airspeed for the landing. Too slow and the aircraft would stall. Too fast and it would shatter on impact. 400 feet. Inside the bomber, Hayes gently pulled back on the control yoke. The nose lifted slightly. Airspeed dropped 120 knots. The bomber struck the water. The impact was catastrophic. The fuselage slammed against the waves with enormous force. The entire aircraft flexed violently. Metal screamed, rivets popped loose. Huge plumes of water exploded into the air. The bomber skipped once across the surface like a thrown stone, then again. Finally, it slammed down and began sliding across the water in a massive wall of spray. Inside the aircraft, the crew were thrown forward against their harnesses. Equipment tore loose and flew across the cabin. The bombardier, Lieutenant Carl Vickers, felt his shoulder dislocate when he smashed into the instrument panel. In the ball turret, Martinez was still halfway out when the turret slammed into the water. The metal structure collapsed under the force of the impact. The bomber slid nearly 300 yards before finally stopping. Water began pouring into the aircraft immediately through dozens of holes and cracks. "Everybody out!" "NOW," Hayes shouted. Men scrambled toward every possible exit. Top hatch, waist gun windows, nose hatch. Morrison kicked open the escape hatch above the cockpit. He grabbed Hayes and shoved him upward. "Move, skipper." They climbed onto the wing. The bomber was already beginning to sink. It tilted slowly to the left as water rushed inside. They had maybe 2 minutes before it disappeared. 200 yards away, Howell faced his own disaster. His powerless Thunderbolt struck the water nose first. The heavy engine acted like an anchor.
The fighter flipped violently forward. Howell's head slammed into the gun sight. Blood ran down his face. Freezing water flooded the cockpit instantly. The cold was shocking, like knives stabbing into his skin. He fumbled desperately for the canopy release. His fingers were already numb. Finally, he found the handle. He pulled it. The canopy blew free. Water rushed inside. Howell pushed himself upward and out of the sinking fighter just seconds.
He disappeared beneath the surface. He surfaced gasping for air.
The freezing water stole his breath instantly. 200 yards away, he saw the bomber crew jumping into the ocean. Bright orange life rafts were inflating on the surface. Some of the emergency gear had survived the crash. Howell began swimming toward them. Each stroke felt heavier than the last. His boots felt like lead. The cold drained his strength quickly. Finally, he reached one of the life rafts. Strong hands grabbed his arm
And pulled him aboard.
When he looked up, he saw Robert Hayes staring down at him. Hayes laughed weakly despite the freezing cold. "Jersey, you crazy bastard, you actually did it." Howell tried to answer, but his teeth were chattering too violently. Someone threw a blanket around his shoulders. The men began counting survivors. 8 men in the first raft, 3 in the second, 11 total, 10 bomber crew, 1 fighter pilot. Everyone had survived the crash landing. Then Hayes looked around.
Again, his face suddenly changed. "Wait, where's Martinez?"
The men looked at each other silently. Finally, Donnelly spoke quietly. He didn't make it out. "Skipper, the ball turret collapsed." Hayes closed his eyes slowly. 9 lives saved, 1 lost. The cruel math of war. And they were still floating in the freezing waters of the English Channel. The life rafts rocked violently in the cold waves of the English Channel. Gray water stretched endlessly in every direction. Above them, the sky dull and silent now. The roar of engines and gunfire had disappeared. For the first time in hours, there was only the sound of wind and water. Robert Hayes sat hunched inside the rubber life raft, gripping the edge with numb hand. His flight suit was soaked. The cold had already begun creeping into his bones. Across from him, James Howell shivered uncontrollably. His teeth rattled as his body struggled to maintain heat. Someone wrapped another blanket around his shoulders, but it did little. "Stop the cold. How long can we survive out here?" Briggs asked quietly. Morrison answered. "Water temperature around 50 degrees. He paused, "Maybe 20 minutes before hypothermia sets in." Nobody spoke after that. They all understood what it meant. 20 minutes. That was the clock now ticking against them. The bomber had sunk beneath the waves less than 5 minutes earlier. The only evidence of the crash was a thin line of floating debris scattered across the water. A piece of wing here, a floating ammunition box there, bits of metal slowly drifting away with the current. Hayes stared at the empty water where his aircraft had disappeared. Months of missions, hundreds of hours flying that machine, gone in seconds. He turned toward Howell. "You stayed," Hayes said quietly. Howell shrugged weakly, could barely speak through the shivering. "Told you I wasn't leaving." The men in the raft exchanged glances. None of them knew exactly what to say. This man had chosen to die them rather than abandon them. Few soldiers ever faced a choice like that. And even fewer made the choice Howell had made. Minutes passed slowly. The cold grew worse. Briggs tried rubbing his hands together, but his fingers were already stiff. Kendrick whispered a prayer under his breath. Donnelly stared at the horizon desperately, searching for any sign of rescue. But the ocean remained empty. 10 minutes. The wind picked up slightly. The waves rocked the rafts harder now.
"Inside occasionally, soaking their already frozen legs. How long have we been out here?"
Briggs asked. 10 minutes, maybe 12, Morrison answered. "Howell, you still with us?" Hayes asked. The fighter pilot nodded weakly. His lips had turned blue. Hypothermia was coming quickly. "Stay awake," Hayes said firmly. "Talk to us." Howell forced a weak grin. "Never thought I'd end up swimming in the channel today," chuckled faintly. "Hell of a landing you made. Not my best," Howell muttered. The men laughed weakly, even in the freezing water. Humor somehow survived. 15 minutes. The cold became unbearable now. Several men were shaking violently. Briggs could barely feel his legs. Donnelly's hands had turned pale and stiff. Hayes forced himself to stay alert. If anyone lost consciousness now, they might never wake up. He scanned the horizon again. Still nothing. Just endless gray water. Then Kendrick suddenly pointed. "Wait, do you see that?" Everyone turned. It was only a small dark shape far in the distance. A speck moving across the water. Then it grew larger. A boat, a fast-moving boat, heading directly toward them. Hope exploded through the rafts like electricity. "Rescue boat," Briggs shouted. Hayes grabbed the emergency signal flare. His numb fingers struggled to hold it steady. He fired it into the air. The bright red flare streaked upward and burst into smoke above the water. The approaching boat immediately changed direction slightly. They had been seen. A few minutes later, the vessel came close enough for the men to see the markings clearly. It was a Royal Air Force rescue launch. A British crewman stood at the bow scanning the water with binoculars. When he spotted the life rafts, he waved and shouted something to the captain. The boat accelerated. The engine roared as it cut through the waves. Moments later, it pulled alongside the rafts. British sailors leaned over the railing and began pulling the freezing airmen aboard one by one.
"Easy now, lads,"
one sailor said. "We've got you." They helped Hayes aboard first, then Morrison, then the rest of the crew. Finally, 2 sailors grabbed Howell and hauled him onto the deck. He collapsed instantly. His legs couldn't hold him anymore. A British officer stepped forward and looked at the exhausted survivors. "What happened out there?" Hayes pointed weakly toward Howell. "That man stayed with us the whole way.
The officer raised an eyebrow. How far? 90 miles, Hayes answered. He fought off nearly 20 German fighters. Then he ran out of fuel and ditched beside us. The British officer looked down at the shivering fighter pilot. For a moment he said nothing, then he nodded slowly. Well done, Yank. Well done indeed. The sailors wrapped the men in blankets and gave them hot tea. The warmth felt almost painful after the freezing water. One by one, the survivors began to relax. They were alive. Against all odds, they had survived the rescue boat toward England. The coastline slowly appeared on the horizon. As the boat sped across the channel, Hayes sat beside Howell quietly. You know, Hayes said softly, you could have turned back. Howell stared at the ocean. Why didn't you? Howell shrugged. Seemed like the right thing to do. Hayes smiled faintly. Sometimes the simplest answers carried the most meaning. Within an hour, the rescue launch reached the English coast. Ambulances were already waiting at the dock. Medical team helped the freezing airmen onto stretchers. Doctors rushed Howell away immediately. His body temperature had dropped dangerously low, but he was alive. They were all alive except one, Sergeant Eddie Martinez, the ball-turd gunner who never escaped the sinking bomber. War rarely allowed perfect endings, but this one had come close. The survivors spent several days recovering in a military hospital on the English coast. Doctors treated cuts, bruises, and the early stages of hypothermia. Men had broken ribs. Others carried shrapnel wounds from the battle in the sky, but they were alive, and every single one of them knew exactly why. James Howell, the young fighter pilot from New Jersey who refused to abandon them. Word of what happened spread quickly through the air bases of England. Stories like this moved fast among bomber crews and fighter pilots. Men who flew those missions understood exactly how rare such loyalty was in the sky. Many fighter pilots escorted bombers, would sacrifice their own chance of survival for one crippled aircraft. But Howell had done exactly that. 3 days later, the crew of the B-17 were called to attend a small ceremony at the airfield. The morning sky above the base was gray and quiet. A handful of officers stood near a small wooden platform. Several bomber crews watched from a distance. And standing in front of them all was James Howell. He looked uncomfortable in the neatly pressed uniform they had given him. His bandaged forehead showed where he had struck the gun sight during the crash landing, but he stood straight, calm, almost embarrassed by the attention. An officer stepped forward holding a small box. Inside it was one of the highest military decorations awarded by the United States Army Air Forces, the Distinguished Service Cross. The citation was read aloud. The officer's voice carried clearly across the quiet airfield. For extraordinary heroism in combat against enemy forces on October 12, 1943, described the crippled bomber, the repeated attacks by enemy fighters, the decision to remain with the damaged aircraft despite critical fuel levels, the aerial combat against overwhelming odds, and finally, the deliberate decision to ditch his own fighter aircraft in the English Channel rather than abandon the bomber crew. When the officer finished reading, he stepped forward and pinned the medal to Howell's uniform. The gathered airmen began to clap, but the loudest applause came from one group standing near the front. The surviving crew of the B-17. Robert Hayes stepped forward. He raised his hand in a crisp salute. The rest of his crew followed. 10 men standing together, 9 lives saved. Howell returned the salute quietly. He still looked uncomfortable with the attention. After the ceremony ended, Hayes approached him. Never really thanked you properly, Hayes said. Howell smiled slightly. No need, there is, Hayes replied. He extended his hand. Howell shook it. For a moment, neither man said anything. Sometimes words simply weren't enough. The war continued. There were still many missions left to fly. More bombers would take off, more fighters would escort them, and many men would never return. But the story of that October day remained with those who lived it. Years after the war ended, Robert Hayes was asked during an interview about the moment their bomber began falling out of the sky. He thought about the question for a long time before we knew we were dead, he said quietly. Everyone in that aircraft knew it. We had 2 engines left, half the airplane was shot up, and we were over enemy territories. Then this fighter pilot showed up. He stayed with us when he should have left. He fought for us when the odds were impossible, and when he ran out of fuel. Hayes looked down at his hands. He ditched in the ocean so he wouldn't die alone. The interviewer asked him what he would call that kind of courage. Hayes shook his head slowly. I don't have a word for it. Courage doesn't really cover it. After the war ended, James Howell returned home to New Jersey. He went back to farm life, quiet life. He rarely talked about his time in combat. When people asked about the medal he had received, he usually changed the subject. For him, it wasn't about the medal, it was about the men who didn't come home, and the ones who did, but the bomber crew never forgot him. Every year until the end of his life, Howell received Christmas cards from the families of the men he had saved. 9 families, 9 reminders of that day in the sky. James Howell passed away in 1998, but the story of what he did on October 12, 1943 still lives on. A single fighter pilot, 1 impossible decision, 90 miles of hostile sky, and 9 lives saved because 1 man refused to leave his brothers behind. The men who flew these missions understood sacrifice in ways most of us never will. They climbed into aircraft, knowing they might not return. They flew into storms of flak and fighters because someone had to. And sometimes
They stayed when every rule of survival said they should leave, because in war, as in life, brothers don't abandon brothers, and that is the legacy of James Howell, a pilot who chose loyalty over safety, sacrifice over survival, and in doing so, showed the world what true heroism looks like.